It was an ordinary afternoon in the bustling heart of the city, where people moved in all directions, their lives interwoven like threads in a complex tapestry. The air buzzed with the hum of car engines, distant chatter, and the occasional bark of a street vendor calling out to passing customers. Amid the chaos, a man named Marcus strolled through the plaza, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his well-worn jacket. Marcus was no stranger to this area. He had lived in the neighborhood his entire life, and the streets were as familiar to him as the lines on his hands. Marcus, a towering figure with a warm smile and an easygoing demeanor, was well liked by most who knew him. He had a knack for fixing things, bicycles, radios, even broken hearts with his humor, and often lent a helping hand to those in need. But today, as he walked out of a small corner store clutching a bag of groceries, something unexpected happened that would flip his world upside down. "Hey, stop that man," a voice suddenly shouted, cutting through the everyday noise. Heads turned, and Marcus froze mid-step, his heart pounding. The voice belonged to the store clerk, a wiry young man who looked as flustered as he was determined. In his hand, he clutched a receipt, waving it in the air like evidence at a trial. "He stole something." Marcus's face twisted in confusion as the clerk's words hung in the air, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The crowd began to murmur, some stepping back, others stepping closer, curious to see what would happen next. A wave of unease washed over Marcus, but he didn't run. Instead, he held his ground, the bag of groceries still dangling from his hand. "Stole?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "I just paid for this." But the clerk wasn't convinced. "I saw you," he snapped, pointing an accusatory finger. "You put something in your pocket before you left. Don't try to play innocent." By now, a small crowd had gathered, forming a loose circle around Marcus. Their faces held a mixture of curiosity, doubt, and, in some cases, quiet judgment. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, heavy and intrusive, as though they were peeling back layers of his soul to find the truth. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Look, you've got this all wrong," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside him. "Check my bag, check my pockets. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine." But the clerk wasn't backing down, and neither was the growing crowd. A few murmured phrases floated through the air. "He doesn't look like the type, maybe he did it, why would the clerk lie?" Each one stinging Marcus like a bee. The weight of their suspicion pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. It wasn't long before someone suggested calling the police. Marcus's stomach dropped at the thought. He knew all too well how situations like this could escalate, how quickly assumptions could spiral out of control. He had seen it happen to others, had read the stories and heard the warnings from his mother growing up. But this was different. This was him, Marcus, a man who had never so much as jaywalked, now standing in the middle of a public square, accused of something he didn't do. "Call the cops," Marcus said finally, his voice firm. "Let's clear this up right now. I have nothing to hide." The clerk hesitated, perhaps taken aback by Marcus's confidence, but he quickly nodded. "Fine," he said, pulling out his phone. "We'll see about that." As the minutes stretched on, the tension only grew. Some in the crowd began recording the scene on their phones, their cameras capturing every uncomfortable detail. Marcus stood tall, refusing to let the situation break him, but inside, his mind raced. How could this be happening? What had he done to deserve this? And then, out of nowhere, a voice broke through the din wait. "I think the store has cameras," someone said, pointing toward the small black dome mounted above the store's entrance. "Check the footage." The clerk hesitated for a moment, then seemed to relent. "Fine," he muttered, stuffing his phone back into his pocket. "But I'm telling you, I know what I saw." With that, the clerk disappeared into the store, leaving Marcus outside with the crowd, the weight of their stares still bearing down on him. The seconds felt like hours as everyone waited, the anticipation building like the tension before a storm. Marcus tried to steady his breathing, to keep his mind from wandering to the worst-case scenarios. He clung to the hope that the camera would clear his name, that the truth would set him free. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. What if the footage wasn't clear? What if the camera had missed the moment entirely? And even if it proved his innocence, would it erase the judgment he had already faced? The door to the store swung open, and the clerk emerged, holding a small tablet in his hands. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Marcus's heart thumped loudly in his chest as the clerk approached, holding the tablet up for everyone to see. "I checked the footage," the clerk began, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. "And, well, you all need to see this." The crowd pressed closer, their eyes glued to the screen. Marcus stood still, his breath caught in his throat. What would the camera reveal? What truth had been hiding in plain sight? The moment stretched, the tension unbearable, as the clerk hit play. And that's when everything changed. The screen flickered to life, showing the front of the store from an overhead angle. The camera captured Marcus, his movements slow and unassuming, as he approached the counter. The footage was clear, the quality high, and it showed exactly what had happened, or at least, it seemed to. Marcus watched intently, his stomach tight with anticipation. The clerk was visible on the screen, standing behind the counter, looking busy with something. Marcus, in the video, reached into his pocket, but not in the way the clerk had described. The footage showed him pulling out his phone, checking the time, before he placed it back into his pocket. There was no quick motion, no furtive gesture that suggested anything other than what it appeared to be, a man going about his business. But just as the scene seemed to show Marcus's innocence, the footage flickered again. For a split second, the camera's view shifted, showing the corner of the store, just out of focus. It was a minor detail that no one had noticed at first, but it was enough to make Marcus's heart stop. In that blurry moment, a shadowy figure was visible, moving quickly out of the corner, carrying a small, wrapped item that hadn't been there before. The clerk stared at the tablet, his face pale, his breath caught. What is that?" he stammered, his voice unsteady. The crowd murmured, some leaning in closer, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. No one spoke for a moment, and Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet. This wasn't part of the story he had imagined. It was like everything he thought he knew was slowly unraveling, thread by thread. "I don't understand," Marcus muttered, his mind racing. "Who is that? What's going on?" The clerk turned the tablet back toward him, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "I don't know," he said quietly, his voice shaking. "But, that doesn't look like you." Marcus stared at the figure in the footage, his mind working overtime to make sense of it. He hadn't seen anyone else in the store, at least not when he was paying. The figure had moved with such speed, so quickly, that it was almost impossible to make out any distinguishing features. But there was one thing Marcus was certain of, it wasn't him. The silence that followed felt oppressive, each person watching the screen with bated breath. Some eyes flicked nervously between Marcus and the clerk. The tension in the air was thick, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the truth to finally come to light. But instead, a new wave of uncertainty washed over the crowd. If that wasn't Marcus, then who was it? "We need to go back," the clerk said, his voice urgent. "We need to check the footage before that." He quickly rewound the video, his fingers tapping nervously on the screen. The moment before the mysterious figure appeared came into focus, and Marcus's heart skipped a beat. This time, the camera showed a different angle, an aisle further down the store, just before the mysterious figure appeared. There, walking past the shelves, was a man in a hoodie, his face obscured by a large cap. He was moving quickly, almost in a rush, as if trying to avoid being seen. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The hoodie-wearing man was too familiar, the way he moved, it struck a nerve. But the man's face was still hidden in shadow, and as the camera pulled away, the figure disappeared into the corner, where the bag was left behind. The clerk's eyes widened. "That's him. That's who I saw. I think." "What do you mean, you think?" one of the bystanders asked, raising an eyebrow. The clerk's confidence had slipped. He shook his head, clearly unsure now. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. I swear it looked like Marcus, but this isn't him. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some of the people began to step back, unsure of what was happening. Others looked from the clerk to Marcus, as though waiting for an explanation, but Marcus had none. His mind was racing, the pieces of the puzzle falling together in a way he couldn't fully comprehend. The figure in the hoodie, it couldn't have been him. But if not him, who? Just as Marcus opened his mouth to speak, a voice from the crowd interrupted him. Wait, there's more. All eyes turned to the woman who had spoken. She was older, perhaps in her mid-30s, and had been standing at the edge of the crowd, her phone in hand. She stepped forward, holding the phone up with a steady hand, the screen showing a different angle, an angle no one had noticed before. Marcus's heart raced as she hit play. The video was shaky, taken from a different angle outside the store. It showed the back alley, where the hooded figure emerged, carrying a bag and moving quickly toward a van parked at the curb. The van's windows were tinted, but the license plate was visible. I saw him earlier, the woman said, her voice quiet but firm. I saw him walking away from the store, carrying a bag. I didn't think much of it until I saw the footage. The crowd leaned in again, their eyes glued to the small screen. There, in the dim light of the alley, the hooded figure moved swiftly toward the van, slipping inside before it sped off into the street. Marcus's chest tightened as he processed the new piece of information. The man with the hoodie wasn't just a random shopper, he was involved somehow, and there was something about the way he had moved, the way he had disappeared into the van, that felt deliberate. The clerk turned to Marcus, his face full of disbelief. We have to find out who that is. That's the person who caused all this. But Marcus wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, his thoughts racing faster than he could keep up with. Who was that man? What did he have to do with all of this? Why had the clerk mistaken him for Marcus in the first place? And most importantly, why had no one seen him leave the store? The questions piled on, unanswered, unresolved, as the crowd around them fell into an uneasy silence. But then, the woman spoke again, her voice low and tense. I think I know where that van went. Everyone turned to her, the tension in the air palpable. What did she mean? Where had the van gone? What was the next step in this twisted story? Follow me, she said, and without another word, she turned, making her way toward the street. Marcus stood frozen, torn between following her and figuring out what had just happened. But one thing was clear, the answers to the mystery were closer than ever before, and the truth was about to come to light. Marcus hesitated for a moment, his mind swirling with confusion. His feet felt rooted to the spot as the woman in the crowd began to walk away, her purpose clear, her determination unwavering. For a split second, he almost thought about staying behind, just to clear his head, to gather his thoughts, but something deep inside him told him he needed to follow her. His mind was racing too fast for him to make sense of anything. What had just happened? Who was that figure in the hoodie? And why had the clerk, someone who had known him for years, accused him in the first place? The crowd around him was still buzzing, but it had shifted from suspicion to curiosity. People were whispering to each other, eyes darting between Marcus and the mysterious woman. As he started walking toward her, he could feel their gazes on him, like they were measuring him, trying to figure out what kind of man he really was. But Marcus wasn't concerned with their judgment anymore. Something much larger was at play now, and he had to get to the bottom of it. The woman didn't look back as she made her way through the crowd, her pace quick and determined. She moved with a sense of purpose, like someone who knew exactly where they were headed. Marcus quickened his step to catch up, his heart hammering in his chest. As they walked down the street, the noise of the city faded into the background. The busy chatter, the honking cars, the vendors shouting to the crowd, all of it seemed distant now. It was just him, the woman, and the unanswered questions hanging in the air between them. The city felt colder now, darker, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting to be discovered. You know where that van went? Marcus asked, his voice low, trying to keep the panic from creeping in. Why didn't you say anything earlier? The woman slowed for a moment, glancing at him over her shoulder. Her face was hard to read, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Marcus uneasy. "I didn't want to get involved," she said quietly. "But this is bigger than all of us. You don't understand how deep this goes." Marcus felt a shiver run down his spine. Her words, spoken so simply, felt loaded with meaning. What did she mean by bigger than all of us? What was going on here that Marcus didn't understand? They turned a corner and walked down an alley. The shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The streetlights flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, as if someone, or something, was observing them from the darkness. The woman stopped in front of a parked car, her gaze fixed on the street. Marcus stepped up beside her, trying to catch his breath. The air had become thick with tension, like something was about to break, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. "Who is that guy in the hoodie?" Marcus asked again, his voice urgent. "Who was that person in the store?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She stared at the street, as if weighing her next words carefully. After what felt like an eternity, she turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You really don't know, do you?" Marcus shook his head. "No, I don't know." "Who is he? Why did he frame me?" The woman sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the truth was too much to carry. "That guy is more than just a random thief. He's part of something much bigger, something that's been going on for years." She paused, looking around the alley to make sure no one was listening. "And you, Marcus, you're right in the middle of it." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean right in the middle of it?" She took a step closer to him, lowering her voice even further. "The man you saw on the footage, the one who slipped out of the store, he's a part of a larger operation. A group that's been pulling strings in this city for far too long. They've been behind all kinds of schemes, from petty theft to more serious crimes. They know how to manipulate people, to set them up, make them look guilty when they're not." Marcus stared at her, the words slowly sinking in, but the confusion didn't fade. "And you think they're framing me?" The woman nodded grimly. "It's exactly what they're doing. They've set you up, and now they're using you as a pawn in a much larger game. What happened in that store today, what you're being accused of, it's just the beginning." Marcus felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The very thought that he might be part of something far more sinister than a simple misunderstanding made his stomach churn. But he had no time to process it, because she was already walking again, leading him further down the alley. "The footage I showed you? That's just a small piece," she continued, her voice more intense now. "I've been following them for weeks. And that van, it's one of theirs. It's linked to a lot of the strange disappearances around here, people going missing, getting involved in things they didn't even know about. And now you're involved too, whether you like it or not." Marcus tried to keep up, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The weight of her words was pressing down on him, and the more she spoke, the more impossible it seemed to escape whatever had already begun. He was just a regular guy, walking through a store, picking up groceries. He never signed up for this. "Why me?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "What do they want from me? I've done nothing wrong." The woman turned to him, her face softer now. "Because you're the perfect target. They've been watching you, Marcus. They know your routine, your weaknesses, everything. And now, they've made their move. They'll frame you for this, and once they've done that, they'll use you for whatever they need. They'll make sure no one believes your side of the story. They've done it before." Marcus felt a wave of nausea hit him. It was all too much to process. His thoughts were jumbled, spinning like a tornado in his head. The woman's words were like a cold slap to his face, each one unraveling his sense of security, pulling him deeper into something he couldn't escape from. As they walked further into the maze of alleyways, Marcus could feel the walls closing in. The weight of this conspiracy, the sense of being watched, was suffocating. But he couldn't stop now. He needed answers, even if it meant going deeper into the unknown. The woman was his only guide, and the path ahead was dark and uncertain. They reached a narrow passageway at the end of the alley, and the woman stopped. She looked over at Marcus, her eyes intense. "We're close now. But I need you to be ready. Whatever you find, whatever you hear, don't be surprised. And don't trust anyone but me." Marcus swallowed hard, the fear gnawing at him, but he nodded. "I'm ready. Let's get this over with." The woman turned and began to walk into the shadows. Marcus followed, not knowing where this would lead, but understanding that there was no turning back now. The answers were just ahead, and with them, a danger far greater than he had ever imagined. The narrow passageway felt like it was stretching on forever, each step Marcus took adding to the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The sounds of the city, horns, chatter, and the hum of life, were a distant memory now. The deeper they went into the shadows, the quieter it became, until it felt as though the world outside no longer existed. The woman led him without a word, her movements precise, almost rehearsed. It was clear that this wasn't her first time navigating this part of the city. Her calm demeanor only added to the eerie tension, like she was walking into a familiar storm, while Marcus was just a ship caught in the current, unable to steer himself. They reached a rusted door at the end of the alley, hidden behind stacks of old crates and debris. The door looked out of place in the middle of the city, like a secret that had been buried for years. The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, weathered key. She slid it into the lock and turned it with ease, as if she had done this countless times before. Marcus felt his heartbeat race. What was behind that door? Was it more lies? More danger? Or was this where the truth he desperately needed to understand was hidden? His mind was filled with a whirlwind of questions, but one thing was clear: he had no choice but to follow her. He wasn't getting answers anywhere else. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of old wood. It was dark, but a few dim lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the walls. Marcus could just make out the shapes of old furniture and shelves stacked with boxes, most of which looked untouched for years. "Where are we?" Marcus whispered, trying to steady his breath. The woman didn't respond immediately. She walked deeper into the room, her footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. "This is where the pieces come together," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where you'll learn who they really are. And who you really are in all of this." Marcus stood frozen in place for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Who he really was. He'd spent his life trying to keep his head down, to blend in. But now, it seemed as though his ordinary life had been turned upside down, and everything he thought he knew was slipping through his fingers like sand. He hesitated, but then forced himself to follow her deeper into the room. There were rows of filing cabinets and locked drawers scattered around the room. Everything was organized, yet there was a sense of chaos in the air, like everything was waiting to be uncovered, a mystery that had been carefully hidden for too long. The woman stopped in front of a desk cluttered with papers. "I've been piecing this together for months," she said, turning to face him. Her expression was intense, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I've followed the trail, Marcus. And it leads straight to you." Marcus blinked, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "What do you mean?" "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a guy." "I don't have anything to do with, you do now," she interrupted, her voice firm. "They've set this all up. You're a pawn in their game, Marcus. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you'll understand how deep this runs. The man in the hoodie, the theft, none of it was random. It was all planned. You were always meant to be part of this." Marcus took a step back, his mind whirling. He had been pulled into something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. Every instinct inside him screamed to run, to escape from whatever mess he had found himself in. But there was something else, something that stopped him from turning away. Curiosity. Fear. And a strange pull toward the truth, even if it meant facing something he wasn't ready to confront. "What do I have to do with all of this?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Why me?" The woman walked over to the desk and began to flip through the papers, each one adding to the overwhelming sense of mystery surrounding him. "You've been chosen," she said, still not looking up. "They've been watching you for a long time. And now they need you. They've been making their moves, one step at a time. They've used others before you. But you're the one they need to push their plan forward." Marcus swallowed hard. "Who are they? What do they want from me?" The woman paused, turning to face him. Her eyes were hard now, almost filled with pity. "They're a group of powerful individuals who have been manipulating the system for years. They operate in the shadows, pulling strings and influencing decisions. They control everything. And you," she shook her head, her voice growing quieter. "You're going to help them complete something they've been working on for far too long." A cold wave of realization washed over Marcus. The fear in his chest twisted and tightened as her words sank in. He was no longer a bystander in this story. He wasn't just some guy who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was part of something much larger, a game of power, manipulation, and control. And he had no idea how far this would go, or what role he would play. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, the doubt in his voice evident. "For all I know, you're part of this too." The woman sighed, clearly frustrated, but there was no malice in her eyes, only the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting this battle for far too long. "You don't have a choice," she said softly. "If you don't trust me, you'll be swallowed up by them. You'll become just another pawn in their game, another piece they can use and throw away." Marcus stood in silence, trying to make sense of everything. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the weight of the woman's words pressed harder with each passing moment. There was so much he didn't understand, so many pieces of the puzzle that were still missing. Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind him. He spun around, instinctively stepping closer to the woman. In the dim light, he could make out the shadowy figure of someone else approaching them, a tall man in a dark suit. The man's expression was unreadable, and he moved with the same quiet confidence that the woman had displayed earlier. "Who is that?" Marcus whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman's eyes flicked nervously to the figure, and then she stepped between Marcus and the man. "Stay close," she muttered under her breath. The man stopped just a few feet away from them, his gaze locking onto Marcus. "You've come this far," he said, his voice low and calm. "But don't think for a second that you're ready for what's ahead. You're in too deep now. And there's no turning back." The man's words hung in the air, thick with menace. "There's no turning back." The weight of them settled deep in Marcus' chest, making his heart beat louder in his ears. He had no idea what was coming next, but it was clear now that whatever it was, it would change everything. The woman stood motionless, her eyes narrowed as she kept her gaze fixed on the man in the suit. She had said there was no turning back, but that didn't mean she was going to let Marcus go quietly. She was his only chance, but with this new person arriving, he wasn't sure who could be trusted. His mind raced, running through every possible outcome. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the unease that roiled inside him. He had to find out who was pulling the strings, who was watching him, and why. The man smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Names don't matter, kid. What matters is what comes next. You've already played your part. But now, you're a liability. A loose end that needs to be tied up." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Marcus feel like he was trapped in a tightening vice. Marcus' pulse quickened. He could feel the air shift, the space between them narrowing. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in on him. He glanced back at the woman, but she wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes were trained on the man in the suit, and there was a flicker of hesitation in her expression, something like fear. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked, his words coming out sharper than he intended. "What do you want from me?" The man stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Marcus up. "We want control, Marcus. You're part of something bigger than you understand. Everything you've been told, everything you think you know about this world, it's a lie. You're going to be the key to unlocking the next phase of our plan. He paused, letting his words sink in. Marcus could feel the weight of them, a chilling truth that crawled under his skin. What was he being pulled into? What was this plan? And how did he fit into it? I don't care about your plan, Marcus shot back, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. I'm not playing any more games. The man's smile didn't falter, but there was a glimmer of something, amusement, perhaps, in his eyes. You already are, whether you want to or not. He glanced over at the woman, who had taken a few steps back, her expression hardening. But don't worry. We'll make sure you're taken care of. No one escapes this. It's too late for that. Marcus' stomach churned. What are you talking about? What do you want with me? I told you, the man said, his voice like cold steel. Control. You're a part of something that's been years in the making. But there's more at stake now. You're not just some pawn, Marcus. You're the final piece. Without you, nothing moves forward. And if you don't cooperate, he let the sentence hang in the air. The threat left unspoken but clear enough to send a shiver down Marcus' spine. Marcus wanted to lash out, to run, anything to break the suffocating tension that was slowly crushing him. But something in the man's words struck him deep. There was no going back. No escape. Whatever this was, it had already reached a point of no return. Where's the evidence? The woman asked suddenly, her voice low but insistent. The man turned to her, his eyes narrowing. You don't need to concern yourself with that. I want to see it, she pressed, stepping forward. I've been working on this for months. If we're going to do this, we do it my way. Marcus watched them, the dynamic between them shifting before his eyes. It was like the woman was fighting for him, even though he wasn't sure what she was fighting for. Was it for herself? Or for him? And if he didn't cooperate, would she turn against him, too? It was impossible to tell. The man hesitated, but only for a moment, before nodding slightly. Fine. You'll see the evidence. But understand this, once you see it, there's no going back. The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what the evidence could be. Was it a piece of the puzzle he hadn't seen yet? Or was it the thing that would finally reveal the truth of what was happening to him? Let's go, the man said, turning sharply and walking toward the back of the room. The woman followed, her footsteps deliberate. Marcus stayed close behind them, but the sense of unease in his chest had only grown. The deeper they went into the room, the darker it seemed to get. He had no idea where this was leading, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that he was only scratching the surface of something much larger, something much darker. They reached a corner of the room, where a large steel door stood. The man motioned to it without saying a word, and the woman stepped forward, unlocking it with a key from her pocket. The door swung open, revealing a small room beyond, a room filled with monitors, wires, and blinking lights. It looked like some kind of control center. This is where it all comes together, the man said, his voice a low murmur. Everything you've been asking about, everything you've been wondering about, will be answered here. Marcus stepped inside, feeling a mix of dread and curiosity. He couldn't believe this was happening. Was this all some elaborate trap? Some twisted game? He had been thrust into a world he never imagined existed, and now it was all unfolding before him in a way he could barely comprehend. The monitors flickered to life, displaying images of different locations around the city. Some were places he recognized, while others were unfamiliar, marked by timestamps and cryptic notations. The man stepped up to the closest monitor and pressed a few buttons. A new image appeared, a video, shaky and unclear at first, but then it sharpened into focus. It was a grainy shot of Marcus, taken from an alleyway. The same alley where he had been accused of stealing. The same place where everything had started. And as the video played, Marcus could feel his blood run cold. This wasn't just a surveillance video. It was a recording of him being watched, manipulated. And in the corner of the screen, there was a face, a man he didn't recognize. A man with eyes that were far too familiar. Who is that? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man in the suit didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the video play out, and with each passing second, the reality of the situation began to settle like a weight on Marcus' shoulders. What he had thought was a random incident, the accusation, the chase, the confusion, was all part of something much bigger. Something far more dangerous. Marcus' heart pounded as the figure on the screen moved into clearer view. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with an expression of calculated calm. He wasn't just an ordinary bystander or passerby. There was something unsettling about him. The way he stood, like he was in control of everything around him, sent a chill crawling up Marcus' spine. "Who is he?" Marcus repeated, trying to steady his breath, but the words didn't come easily. He needed answers, but all he got in response was a slight smirk from the man in the suit. "That's someone who has a lot of influence in this city," the man said, finally speaking up. His voice was a smooth whisper, as though every word had been carefully measured. "A shadow that controls what most people can't see. You've been caught in his web without even knowing it." The air in the room seemed to thicken with each word. Marcus felt the weight of the truth settling down on him, suffocating him, but he couldn't quite make sense of it. What had he gotten involved in? What game was he being forced to play? "Why am I here?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking despite his efforts to keep it steady. He couldn't understand it. This man in the suit, this shadowy figure on the screen, what was their connection? Why was Marcus being dragged into this tangled mess of lies and manipulation? The woman beside him finally spoke, her voice sharp and direct. "You don't know yet, do you?" She looked over at Marcus, her expression hard. "You're part of something bigger than just some petty accusation. This is about control, Marcus. Control of information, control of power, and you're at the center of it." Marcus' mind raced, trying to connect the dots. He thought back to the day everything changed, the moment he was accused of stealing, when his life seemed to crumble around him. But that wasn't the beginning, was it? That was just the spark that lit the fire. He had been caught in the middle of something long before that, something that involved forces much darker and more powerful than he could have ever imagined. "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked again, this time more desperate. The man in the suit sighed, almost as though he were bored. "We want what's ours. You're just the key to unlock it. There are many pieces to this puzzle, but you're the last one. The final piece." He moved closer, the intensity of his presence suffocating. "You've been led to believe that you're in control, but you've never been. Not once." Marcus' eyes darted to the woman beside him, but she was no longer looking at him. Instead, her eyes were focused on the man in the suit. It was clear she had been expecting this moment. Was she part of this plan? Had she known more than she had let on? "Don't listen to him," she said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the room. "They're trying to manipulate you, just like they've done with so many others." The man in the suit raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh, so now you're playing the hero?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're as much a part of this as anyone else. No one here is innocent." Marcus felt the weight of those words, heavy on his shoulders. The woman, his only ally, wasn't as free from this web as she had led him to believe. Were they all just pawns in a game they didn't understand? And if that was the case, who could he trust? Who was on his side? The man in the suit turned back to the monitors. "The evidence you're looking for is all here, Marcus. But you won't like what you find. Once you see it, once you understand the full picture, there's no going back. The truth is messy and painful, but it's the only thing left for you to grasp. Unless," he added with a sly grin, "you want to keep pretending that none of this is real." Marcus swallowed hard. His instincts screamed for him to run, to get out of this room and never look back. But something inside him refused to walk away without answers. He needed to know what had really happened that day in the alley. What had triggered the events that led to his accusation, and how was it all tied into the shadowy figure on the screen? With a shaking hand, he reached forward and pressed a button, pausing the video. "I want to see it all. I need to know what's going on. The man in the suit smiled, a cold, calculating expression that sent a ripple of unease through Marcus. So be it. But don't say I didn't warn you. The woman beside him stepped back, her expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken since Marcus made his decision. Was she silently supporting him, or was she just waiting for him to stumble? It was hard to tell. The man in the suit motioned to the large screen in front of them, and the video shifted. The grainy footage cleared up, showing an aerial view of the alley where everything had started. The camera zoomed in, focusing on the moment when Marcus had been accused of stealing. The confrontation, the shouting, the confused bystanders. But what Marcus didn't see, what he hadn't noticed before, was the man in the background, the same one from the earlier footage. The shadowy figure was standing just out of frame, watching everything unfold with a look of cold calculation on his face. Then, the camera shifted again, this time showing a different angle. The man in the suit turned the volume up on the monitor. Marcus could hear the faint sound of voices, muffled at first, but then clearer as the camera zoomed in. The man in the background was speaking to someone Marcus didn't recognize. The conversation was low, barely audible, but Marcus could make out a few words. He's the one, we need to take care of him before he figures it out. The blood drained from Marcus' face as the full implications of those words sank in. They had known. They had been watching him for a long time. Who were they talking about? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man in the suit didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, watching Marcus closely, waiting for him to connect the dots. The woman's voice finally broke the silence. They were talking about you. They knew this was coming. They knew you would start asking questions. Marcus' heart pounded in his chest. He had been right all along. There was something bigger at play here, something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. As the video continued, the camera cut to another angle. This time, it showed a man, someone Marcus knew, someone he had trusted, speaking with the shadowy figure. A chill ran through him. His own betrayal was unfolding before his eyes. The man he had trusted was part of this plan all along. Why are they doing this? Marcus asked, barely able to speak as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The man in the suit's eyes gleamed with something dangerous, something Marcus couldn't quite understand. That's a question you'll have to answer for yourself. But one thing was clear. The truth was far more twisted than he could have ever imagined. Marcus' mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle clicked together, each new revelation feeling like another weight being added to his already heavy shoulders. His head spun as he tried to process everything, the betrayal, the manipulation, the cold, calculated moves of the people involved. The image of the shadowy figure standing in the alley, silently pulling the strings, haunted him. It was clear now, he had been a pawn in a game he hadn't even known was being played. He looked back at the screen, his gaze fixed on the faces of the men he had trusted, those who had been so close to him, yet so far removed from the truth. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced. The man he thought was his ally, the one who had promised to help him, was no different from the rest. Was anyone ever truly on his side? Or had he been surrounded by people all along who were only pretending to care, only pretending to be his friends? The woman beside him shifted her weight, a sense of impatience growing in her demeanor. This isn't getting you anywhere, Marcus. You're wasting time watching the past unfold. You need to think ahead. He could feel her eyes on him, her intensity only adding to the pressure building inside of him. She was right, though. This was just a glimpse into the past. He couldn't stay here, lost in these old tapes, unable to change what had already happened. What he needed was to figure out how to stop whatever was coming next. He needed to find out what the shadowy figure, the man in the suit, and the people involved in this twisted game were planning, and, more importantly, how he could escape the trap they'd set for him. What happens next? Marcus asked, his voice low. He wasn't sure if he was asking the woman or himself. The question hung in the air like an echo, unanswered. The woman didn't reply immediately. Her eyes flickered to the screen and back to him. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully. There's more, Marcus. Much more. You're not the only one being manipulated. You're part of something bigger, and they've got their eyes on more than just you. He looked at her, confusion clouding his mind. What do you mean, more than just me? He could barely believe what he was hearing. How could there be more? Hadn't the accusation and the video footage already been enough to unravel everything? The woman hesitated. It's not just about the theft, Marcus. They're using you to get to something, or someone, else. The theft was a smokescreen. The people involved in this want something more valuable than money. She paused again, her lips pressing into a thin line. They want control. Marcus' stomach twisted as he tried to comprehend her words. Control? What kind of control? He wasn't some high-ranking official, some powerful figure with influence. What was so special about him that they would go to these lengths? Who else is involved? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question seemed to hang in the air, thick with tension. The woman leaned closer to him, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I wish I could tell you. But I don't know. I've only seen the pieces, just like you. But they're moving quickly, and we don't have much time before they make their next move. The words settled like ice in Marcus' veins. He was being pulled deeper into a world of shadows, a world where nothing made sense, and every person was a player in a game he didn't understand. The weight of the unknown pressed down on him, suffocating him, and yet he couldn't back away. Not now. What do I do? He asked, his voice barely audible. He felt like a man caught in a riptide, swept away by forces beyond his control. The path ahead was uncertain, and every step felt like it could lead him into danger. The woman straightened, her gaze becoming more focused. You need to find out who's behind all of this, she said, her words firm, almost like an order. You need to take control of your story, Marcus. Only then can you make sure it doesn't end with you taking the fall. The words burned in his mind. Take control. But how? He was no detective. He wasn't a spy or a hacker. He was just an ordinary guy trying to clear his name, and now he was being thrust into something far beyond his understanding. The man in the suit, the shadowy figure, the people who'd betrayed him, it was all too much. Do you think they'll just let me walk away from this? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The woman didn't answer immediately. She studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp as if reading him, gauging his next move. Finally, she spoke, her tone soft but deadly serious. No. But that's why we have to act fast. We don't have the luxury of time. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing around the room. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The web was tightening around him, but there had to be a way out. He couldn't just sit here and wait for someone to pull the strings on his life. No, he had to act. He had to uncover the truth, expose the ones pulling the strings, and take back control. He looked back at the woman. How do we start? He asked, his voice determined, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, a flicker of approval in her eyes. We dig deeper. We find out who's behind this and what they're really after. But you have to be ready, Marcus. This is just the beginning. The more you learn, the more dangerous it gets. Marcus nodded. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, but there was no turning back now. He had to know the truth. No matter where it led. As he turned to face the screen once more, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the room. His heart skipped a beat. Were they here? Was someone coming for him? The tension in the air grew thick, each second stretching out into eternity. We have to move, the woman said urgently, her voice breaking the silence. Now. Marcus didn't hesitate. They had no time to lose. Whatever was waiting for him next, he was ready to face it head-on. The storm was coming. And he was going to be at the center of it. Marcus could feel his pulse racing in his temples as he followed the woman down the dimly lit hallway. Every step felt heavier than the last. The air around him was thick with tension, and the walls seemed to close in as they made their way through the building. His mind was spinning with questions, all leading back to one terrifying thought: who could he trust now? The footsteps that had echoed from behind them grew louder, and Marcus glanced over his shoulder. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow moving just beyond the corner of the hallway. His heart stopped. Were they being followed? Had someone discovered their plan? His breath caught in his throat, but the woman didn't seem to notice the change in his demeanor. She was moving with purpose, eyes forward, and didn't once falter in her steps. They reached a small door at the end of the corridor, hidden behind a few stacked boxes. She turned to him, her voice low but urgent. "Stay quiet. We can't afford any mistakes now." Marcus nodded, barely hearing her as he tried to steady his racing thoughts. They entered the room swiftly, and the door closed behind them with a soft click. The room was small, bare except for a single desk and a few scattered files. The woman gestured to the desk, where a laptop was open and running. "We need to access the system," she said. "This will give us everything we need." Marcus stared at the screen. The image that flickered to life before him made his stomach churn. It was a live feed, security cameras showing different parts of the building, including the alley outside. He wasn't sure if it was the screens that made him nervous or the realization that his every move had been watched. The man in the suit, the shadowy figure, who else had been observing him? Before he could voice his thoughts, the woman moved quickly to the laptop, her fingers dancing over the keys. "We're running out of time," she muttered under her breath, her brow furrowed in concentration. Marcus could feel the weight of the seconds slipping by. He glanced toward the door again, his senses on edge. What was happening outside that room? What were they walking into? Every time he thought he understood the situation, it turned out there was another layer to peel back. What were they after? Who was behind all of this? And most importantly, what did they want from him? The woman's voice broke through his spiral of thoughts. We've got access to their files." Marcus took a step closer, his eyes scanning the screen. What he saw next made his stomach churn. There were countless names, files, and coded messages, but one file stood out. It had his name on it. His full name. His entire history, everything he thought he had left behind, was in that file. The data wasn't just about the incident in the store, it was personal. It included details about his life, his family, and even his movements over the past few days. It felt like a violation that had been planned for far longer than he could have imagined. "What the hell is all this?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely above a breath. The woman's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she quickly opened the file. A few seconds passed in silence, then she looked up at him, her face tense. "This is just the beginning. They've been watching you. They've been tracking you for months. And now, they're ready to make their move." Marcus' heart skipped a beat. Watching him? He had no idea how deep this went. He had never felt so exposed in his life. Every move he'd made, every decision, had it all been manipulated? And now, it seemed like the entire world was closing in on him. As if on cue, a loud bang echoed from the hallway outside the room. Both of them froze, eyes wide. The woman's hand shot out, slamming down the lid of the laptop. She grabbed Marcus by the arm, pulling him towards the small closet in the corner. The sound of footsteps came closer, and Marcus could hear voices, loud, indistinct, but undeniably approaching. His heart was pounding in his chest. Were they here? Were they already too late? The woman's grip tightened on his arm. "Stay quiet. Don't make a sound." Marcus nodded, barely able to breathe. He could feel the heat of his own fear, the way his body trembled in the silence of the closet. Outside, the voices grew louder. The door to the room creaked open, and Marcus held his breath. His mind raced with every possibility. Who could it be? What did they want now? Would they find them? From the darkness of the closet, Marcus strained to listen. He could hear the low murmur of voices, the scraping sound of metal against concrete, footsteps shuffling. He felt the woman beside him tense, waiting. They were close. Too close. Then, as if in slow motion, a man's voice echoed into the room. "We know you're in there." A chill ran down Marcus' spine. How did they know? Was this the end? Had they been betrayed, or was there a mole in their midst? The woman shot him a glance, her expression unreadable. She took a slow breath. And without saying another word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device. Marcus watched as she quickly pressed a button. There was a soft, high-pitched beep, and then the power in the building went out. The lights flickered and then died, leaving them in complete darkness. "Go," the woman whispered. Marcus didn't hesitate. They sprinted out of the closet, their feet barely making a sound on the floor as they moved through the darkness. His heart was hammering, adrenaline surging through him as they hurried down the hallway, away from the room and the danger that was closing in on them. Every second felt like an eternity. They turned a corner, and Marcus stumbled, almost losing his balance. He caught himself, but the fear didn't subside. He could hear the heavy footsteps of the men following them, closing in fast. The woman pulled him into another room, and this time, there was no time to think. They had reached the edge of something, Marcus didn't know what, but there was no going back now. As they hid in the shadows, his mind raced with one thought: whatever they had planned for him, he wasn't going down without a fight. The tension in the air was suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew this was the moment that everything would change. The next step would either lead to his freedom or his destruction. And as the footsteps grew louder, Marcus' heart sank. It was time to face whatever came next. The darkness in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears. Every breath was shallow, every movement calculated. He and the woman were pressed against the wall, barely making a sound as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Each passing second felt like an eternity. He could almost feel the tension in the air, the weight of it pressing down on him. What were they walking into? Who were these people chasing them? The woman beside him didn't flinch. She remained perfectly still, her eyes darting around the room, scanning every corner for any possible way out. Marcus' mind was racing. He needed to understand who was behind all of this, why they had been targeted. The answers were just out of reach, and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it seemed. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, but it was the kind of silence that told Marcus they weren't alone anymore. He could feel the presence of someone on the other side of the door. He wasn't sure if they were here to capture him, eliminate him, or force him to give up information he didn't even have. But whatever it wasn't going to end quietly. The woman held her breath, her eyes meeting Marcus. For the briefest moment, he could see the same fear mirrored in her expression. She had been so confident earlier, so sure of their plan, but now, as the silence stretched on, even she couldn't predict what would happen next. The door creaked. A slow, deliberate sound, as if someone was testing it. Marcus' pulse quickened. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. He had to stay focused. They had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. Then, with a sudden jolt, the door burst open. A man in a black suit stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room, his hand resting on the doorframe. Behind him, Marcus could see two other figures, equally imposing, their faces hidden in shadow. The man in the suit stepped inside, his gaze falling on the woman first, then shifting to Marcus. His eyes narrowed. "Found you," the man said, his voice cold and detached. Marcus' breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls closing in once again. How had they found them? What were they going to do to them now? The woman stepped forward, putting herself between Marcus and the man. Her voice was low, but there was a sharp edge to it. "You don't need to do this. It's not too late to stop." The man's expression didn't change. "You think I have a choice," he said with a sigh, as though it was a question that had already been answered. We've been watching you both for a long time. And now, well, now you're a liability. Marcus didn't understand. What did that mean? How had he become a liability? What had they done to make them such a target? He opened his mouth to ask, but the words got caught in his throat. The woman didn't flinch. You're making a mistake. There's more at play here than you know. More than just us. The man laughed, a hollow sound that bounced off the walls. I know exactly what's going on. You think you've uncovered something? You think you're the ones pulling the strings? You're just pawns in a game much bigger than you can imagine. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Pawn? What game was he talking about? He had no idea what was happening. His mind was spinning with possibilities, none of them making any sense. He looked at the woman for answers, but she was just as confused as he was. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together in a tight line. The man in the suit stepped closer, his cold eyes never leaving Marcus. You want to know what's really happening? You want to know who's behind all of this? Well, you're about to find out. He raised his hand, signaling the two figures behind him. They moved quickly, each one grabbing a different arm, pulling Marcus away from the woman. He tried to fight back, but their grip was like iron, unyielding. Panic surged through him, his breath coming in sharp gasps. This couldn't be it. They couldn't take him now, not after everything they had been through. Wait! Marcus shouted, his voice trembling. You can't. What do you want from us? What's going on? The man in the suit smiled, a grim smile that sent chills down Marcus' spine. We've been watching you for a reason. You're part of something much bigger than you know. And now, well, now you get to see how deep this goes. Before Marcus could react, the two men hauled him forward, pulling him toward the door. He could hear the woman behind him, her voice rising in a desperate plea. You don't understand. You're making a huge mistake. Let him go. But her words didn't seem to matter. The men moved with precision, their steps quick and calculated, guiding Marcus down the hallway. His mind raced with fear, confusion, and a growing sense of dread. What had he gotten himself into? Who were these people? And why was he the one being dragged into the center of it all? They reached a door at the end of the hallway, and without a word, the man in the suit opened it. The room beyond was dimly lit, filled with monitors and flashing lights. Marcus could see more people sitting at desks, typing away, their eyes glued to the screens. It looked like some kind of control room. A room that was at the heart of whatever operation was happening here. The man in the suit pushed Marcus inside, and the door slammed shut behind them. Marcus stood there, feeling a wave of panic rise in his chest. What were they going to do to him now? What had he uncovered, and how deep did this rabbit hole go? As he stood in the room, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, the man in the suit spoke again, his voice cold and deliberate. Welcome to the real game. Let's see how well you play. The room seemed to close in around Marcus as the man's words echoed in his mind. The air felt thick with tension, the low hum of machines filling the silence. He felt like a pawn, trapped in a game he didn't understand. Every second that passed added more weight to his growing dread. He had been led here under false pretenses, drawn into something far beyond his control. And now, as the door slammed behind him, he was left with nothing but uncertainty and fear. The man in the suit stepped closer, his expression unreadable. You think you're just a victim in all this, don't you? That you were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Well, that's not entirely true. Marcus' heart raced, his mind whirling. What do you mean? He managed to say, though his voice was barely more than a whisper. What's happening? What do you want with me? The man's cold eyes studied him, almost as if he were analyzing Marcus for weaknesses, searching for a crack in his resolve. It's not about what we want from you, Marcus. It's about what you know, whether you realize it or not. Marcus stiffened, his confusion mounting. I don't know anything. I swear, I don't even know who you are. The man let out a low, almost pitying laugh. You think you've been in control of this situation? Think again. All along, you've been part of a much larger picture. A picture you haven't even begun to comprehend. Marcus' thoughts were racing. He was being played, that much was clear, but how? He had just been living his life, an ordinary man trying to survive. What had he stumbled into that was so dangerous, so complex? Why me? Marcus asked, more desperate now. Why drag me into this? The man's gaze softened, just slightly, though the coldness in his voice remained. You've been running away from the truth. And now we've made sure you can't. We know about your past, Marcus. About everything you've tried to hide. Your actions, your choices, they've led us here. You've unknowingly set things into motion, and we need to know how far it goes. Marcus felt like the room was spinning. His past. He had worked so hard to leave it behind. To forget. But now, here it was, coming back to haunt him. What did these people know? What had he done to bring this on himself? Before he could respond, one of the figures in the corner of the room stepped forward. He was tall, wearing a headset, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a monitor. His eyes were glued to the screen in front of him, his fingers rapidly typing commands. We've got a location, the figure said, his voice sharp and urgent. The man in the suit didn't even look at him. Good. Prepare it. We'll move in soon. Marcus' stomach twisted. What was going on? What location? Who were they after? The questions only piled on, but his fear was suffocating him now. The only thing he could do was try to keep his composure, whatever that meant in this nightmare. He looked around the room at the faces surrounding him. The people in the dimly lit control center seemed as detached as the man in the suit, their eyes fixed on their work. They didn't care about Marcus. He wasn't a person to them. He was just a piece of a much bigger puzzle. A puzzle he didn't even know how to solve. The figure at the monitor spoke again, his voice cutting through Marcus' thoughts. Sir, the file's here. Looks like he really doesn't know much. Just fragments. But it's something. Marcus' mind reeled. What file? What fragments? I don't understand any of this. His voice cracked with panic. What do you want from me? Why am I here? The man in the suit finally turned his attention back to Marcus. His gaze was colder than ever, a sharp glint in his eyes. You're here because we need you. You've been part of this from the start, and whether you realize it or not, your role is crucial. You have something that we need, something you've been carrying without even knowing it. Marcus couldn't breathe. This was worse than he could have imagined. How could he be involved in something so vast, so complex? He wasn't a criminal, a spy, or anything like the people he had read about in books. He was just ordinary. Yet, somehow, he had become central to a plan far beyond his understanding. The figure at the monitor glanced at the man in the suit. We're ready to move out. We can proceed with the next phase. The man in the suit nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Marcus. Take him to the next room. He's going to see just how deep this goes. Without another word, the two figures who had been standing by Marcus's side moved forward, grabbing his arms. He tried to pull away, but their grip was firm, unyielding. They forced him to walk through the narrow hallway, past a series of closed doors. The sense of dread grew with every step. As they reached the next door, Marcus could hear muffled voices coming from within. People talking, arguing, maybe. He couldn't make out the words, but the intensity of the conversation sent a shiver down his spine. What was going on behind that door? One of the men opened it, and Marcus was pushed inside. The moment he stepped through the threshold, he was hit by a wave of sound. Multiple voices filled the room, a chaotic buzz of activity. But what struck him more than the noise was the room itself. It looked like an interrogation room, but it wasn't what he expected. It was a high-tech setup, with screens lining the walls and wires snaking across the floor. In the center of the room, a large table sat with papers, files, and several laptops scattered across it. Sitting at the table were three people. Two men and a woman, all dressed in professional attire, their faces hard with purpose. As Marcus stepped further into the room, their eyes turned toward him, studying him with an almost clinical detachment. He felt like a specimen under a microscope. The man who had been in charge earlier spoke again, his voice low. "Welcome to the heart of it all, Marcus. This is where it ends for you, where you'll finally understand why we've kept you in the dark. But be careful. The more you learn, the harder it will be to get out." The tension in the room rose sharply as Marcus stood there, caught between the unknown and the terrifying possibility that the secrets he had unwittingly uncovered would change everything. His mind was no longer his own, torn between fear and the relentless need for answers. The woman at the table leaned forward, her expression hard. "We've been waiting for you. Now, let's see if you're ready to know the truth." Marcus stood there, his heart pounding in his chest as the woman's words hung in the air. Ready to know the truth? The question lingered, sharp and cold, like a blade poised to strike. He could feel the eyes of the people around him, weighing him, measuring his worth. His mind raced, trying to process what had been happening, but every answer he came up with only seemed to lead to more questions. The tension was thick, suffocating, as the woman gestured to the screen behind her. A map appeared, showing several locations, each marked with a red dot. It seemed familiar, yet out of place. The same locations Marcus had been to recently, the places he had barely noticed, the people he had brushed off as irrelevant. His gut twisted with dread. "We've been watching you for a long time, Marcus." The man beside her spoke, his voice low and foreboding. "You're part of a much bigger picture than you realize. And you've been helping us more than you think." Marcus blinked, his thoughts scrambling. "Helping you? I don't even know who you are. I just want to get out of here." The woman cut him off with a sharp glance, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You want to get out of here? That's not really an option anymore." Suddenly, the monitor flickered, displaying a new message. The room fell silent as everyone's attention shifted toward the screen. Marcus's pulse quickened. The message was cryptic, just a string of numbers and letters. But as his eyes darted across the screen, something caught his attention, a name. His name. "I'm not following," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "What does that mean? Why is my name on that screen?" The man at the table didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the woman, who gave a subtle nod. Without a word, the man stood and walked toward Marcus, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. He leaned in close, his breath cold against Marcus's ear. "You've been part of an experiment, Marcus. An experiment that has been in motion for years, before you even knew you were involved." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Experiment? What was he talking about? He tried to back away, but the two men flanking him stepped forward, blocking his path. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but the truth felt more elusive than ever. I don't understand." Marcus choked out, his voice cracking with desperation. "What experiment? What do you want from me?" The man pulled back and looked him squarely in the eye. "The truth is, Marcus, you've been carrying something inside you, something we planted years ago. Something that connects you to everything. To the people you trust, to the people you've never met. It's all part of the plan." Marcus's mind reeled. He felt like he was drowning in the information, each piece falling into place like a puzzle he was too terrified to finish. No, that's impossible. I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose any of this." The woman stood, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked toward him. She looked at him with a cold, calculating expression, as if he were nothing more than an object of study. "It's too late to deny it, Marcus. You're already part of the system. You've always been part of it." The man spoke again, his voice unwavering. "The files we've gathered, your history, your connections, everything you've done, it's all leading up to this moment. You've unknowingly been helping us build something bigger than you could ever comprehend. Something that will change everything." A sudden chill ran down Marcus's spine. He thought back to everything he'd experienced, the odd occurrences, the strange coincidences, the feeling that something was always just out of reach. And now, with this revelation, it all clicked into place. He had been a puppet, controlled without his knowledge. But the question that burned in his mind was why? What had they been planning? Before he could gather his thoughts, a new figure entered the room. This person was different, older, with a commanding presence that immediately made the others fall silent. The newcomer walked straight toward Marcus, his eyes intense and piercing. "Is he ready?" the new figure asked, his voice deep, like a thunderstorm on the horizon. The man who had been speaking to Marcus nodded slowly. "He's almost there. The pieces are all in place." The newcomer turned his gaze toward Marcus, scrutinizing him as if weighing his every thought. "You've come far, Marcus. But there's one thing you haven't realized yet." Marcus's chest tightened. "What's that?" he asked, barely able to get the words out. The older man smiled, but it was a smile that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. "The truth isn't what you think it is. Not anymore. And what you thought was an accident? It wasn't. You've been chosen for this, Marcus. You've been built for this moment." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Marcus's mind was racing, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Chosen? Built? What was he hearing? None of this made sense. How could he have been built for this? He had lived an ordinary life, he wasn't special. He wasn't anyone important. The older man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, holding it up for Marcus to see. It was sleek and silver, with a faint glow emanating from the screen. Without a word, the man pressed a button. The lights in the room flickered for a moment, and then the walls seemed to shift. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The walls weren't walls at all, they were screens. Screens that displayed scenes of places he had been, people he had encountered, and places he had never been but somehow recognized. His mind exploded with confusion and fear. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something far bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. The stakes had risen to a level he couldn't comprehend. And now, the biggest question of all remained: what did they want with him? As the screens continued to show fragmented images of his life, Marcus could only watch, the feeling of impending doom pressing down on him. The tension in the room was unbearable, and he knew something was coming, something that would change everything once and for all. The room grew colder, and the hum of the machinery intensified, as if the very walls themselves were watching Marcus, waiting for his next move. The older man's eyes never left him, as though he was calculating every reaction, every twitch of Marcus's expression. The screens continued to flicker with scenes, places Marcus had been, faces he recognized, and places he had never even been to before, yet something about them felt oddly familiar, as though they had been part of his life all along. It was all too much, too overwhelming to process. "Why?" Marcus finally choked out, his voice hoarse. "Why me? What is all of this?" The older man smiled again, his lips thin and cold. "Because you're the key, Marcus. You've been the key from the beginning, whether you realized it or not. And now, you're about to find out exactly what that means." Marcus felt his world crashing down around him. He had never imagined his life would spiral into something so terrifying, so beyond his control. He was just a man, trying to live his life, and now everything was unraveling. But despite his fear, a surge of anger rose in him. He wasn't going to let these people control him, not without understanding why, not without knowing what their endgame was. "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked again, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The older man stepped closer, the lights casting long shadows across his face. "We want what you have, Marcus. We want everything you've been hiding. What you don't know. What they don't want you to know. The information you've carried in you your whole life." Marcus froze. Information? What was he talking about? He had no special knowledge. No hidden secret. All he had were his memories, the scattered fragments of his past, some good, some bad, but nothing extraordinary. "You're not making sense," Marcus said, frustration rising in his voice. "I'm just a regular guy. There's nothing special about me. You're all crazy." The man didn't flinch. "You think it's that simple? You've been a part of something far larger than you realize. The question isn't whether or not you're ordinary, because you're not. The real question is, do you want to understand what you've been part of? Do you want to learn the truth?" The older man's words echoed in Marcus's mind. He was part of something bigger. But what was it? Who were these people? The more they spoke, the more Marcus's mind twisted in confusion, trying desperately to piece together any shred of his life that might make sense of this. But there was nothing. A strange noise cut through the air, and Marcus turned to see the woman from before stepping forward. She was holding something, an old, weathered file. She placed it on the table in front of him, and the thud of the heavy file seemed to reverberate through his bones. "This file," she said, her voice eerily calm, "contains everything you've been kept from. The answers you seek. The people you've trusted. The things you thought you knew. But be careful, Marcus. Once you open it, there's no going back." The tension in the room thickened as the file sat between them. For a moment, Marcus was frozen. His eyes flickered from the file to the man and the woman. The weight of their gaze, the unspoken promise of answers, hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Marcus reached out slowly, his hand trembling as he lifted the file. The leather was worn, the edges frayed with time, as if it had seen countless hands before his. His heart pounded in his chest as he flipped it open. The pages inside were filled with cryptic notes, maps, and photographs, all linking him to a network he never knew existed. But it was the first photograph that stopped him cold. It was an image of a young boy, no older than 6, sitting at a desk in a classroom. The boy's face was partially obscured, but there was something about him, something familiar. Marcus stared at the photo for a long time before the pieces began to fall into place. It was him. The boy in the photograph was Marcus. A child version of himself, but he had no memory of this moment, no memory of ever being in that classroom. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a tidal wave. "You were always part of the plan, Marcus," the older man said, his voice low and knowing. "From the very beginning." Marcus's hand dropped the file as the room seemed to spin around him. He staggered back, his mind struggling to keep up with the revelation. His life, his entire existence, had been manipulated from the start. He had never been free. His memories, his choices, his every move had been carefully orchestrated by forces beyond his understanding. "No," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "This isn't possible." The woman stepped forward, her eyes narrowing with a mix of pity and authority. "It's the truth, Marcus. You were raised for a purpose. Every moment, every experience in your life has led to this. But why? Why me? Why was I chosen?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaking now. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, the air thick with the weight of this truth. "What do you want me to do? What's your endgame?" The man looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing the answer. "We don't need you to do anything, Marcus. You've already done it. You've been the catalyst for everything that's about to unfold." Marcus's eyes widened. "What are you talking about? What have I done?" The older man didn't answer. Instead, he nodded to the woman, who reached into her coat and pulled out another device. She pressed a button, and the monitors around the room flickered to life again, showing more images. This time, the images were different, disturbing. They were of Marcus, his every move tracked and recorded. There were pictures of him in places he had been, conversations he had forgotten, even moments he had never realized had been observed. It was as if his entire life had been a series of experiments, and now, the final stage was upon him. "You see, Marcus," the older man said softly, "this is your life now. It's all been leading up to this point. The question is, how will you respond when you learn the full extent of what you're a part of? Marcus stood frozen, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. His life, his choices, his very identity, everything was part of a plan he had never asked for, never understood. And as the room filled with the sound of his own racing heartbeat, he realized one terrifying truth. There was no escape. Marcus's mind raced, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm of disbelief and dread. Every piece of the puzzle that had been presented to him, every terrifying revelation, only led to more questions. What was this plan? What were they preparing him for? He had thought, just moments ago, that he had been a normal man, living his life. But now, it felt as though his very existence had been constructed for some unknown purpose, something he had never agreed to. The older man watched him intently, as though reading every flicker of emotion that passed through Marcus's eyes. His gaze was cold and calculating, but there was an edge of something deeper there, a certainty that Marcus wasn't ready to comprehend. The woman beside him, her face unreadable, remained silent, her eyes fixed on Marcus as though she were waiting for him to make the next move, to grasp the gravity of the situation. Marcus's pulse quickened, and he felt a knot tightening in his stomach. His mind was a blur of images and questions. Was everything he had believed to be true just a lie? Had he been a pawn in a much larger game, one that he had never even suspected? For the first time in his life, Marcus felt the weight of his own existence pressing down on him. He had always thought he had control over his life, his choices. But now, standing in this cold room, surrounded by strangers who seemed to know everything about him, he realized just how powerless he truly was. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Marcus finally asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He wasn't sure who he was asking. Was it the man, the woman, or the universe itself? "Why keep me in the dark?" The older man tilted his head, his lips curling into a small, almost pitying smile. "You couldn't handle the truth, Marcus. You were never meant to know. Until now." Marcus felt his legs weaken, and he stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, erratic gasps. His thoughts scattered, trying desperately to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening to him. But there was nothing. "You're wrong," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "I can handle it. I deserve to know everything. All of it." The woman stepped forward, her hand reaching out in what could have been a comforting gesture, but there was nothing warm about the way she looked at him. "The truth has a price," she said, her voice low and measured. "And it's not something you can undo once it's known." Marcus took a step back, his mind reeling. What did she mean? What price would he have to pay to understand his role in all of this? Before he could process further, the screens around him shifted again. This time, the images were different, much different. They showed a vast underground facility, its corridors filled with rows of people who looked like him, but not quite. They were working, moving mechanically from one task to the next. It was as though they were part of an enormous machine, each person performing their role without question, without individuality. His heart sank. Was this his future? Was this what they had planned for him? The man beside him spoke again, his voice cold but purposeful. "These people, Marcus, are your predecessors. The ones who came before you. They were part of the same system, the same program you're a part of. And now, it's your turn. The question is, will you accept it?" Marcus's mind reeled. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, what he was hearing. Predecessors? A system? A program? Was he one of these people, one of the hundreds of faces that flickered across the screen? "No," Marcus said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "I won't do it. I won't be like them. I won't be another cog in your machine." The older man's eyes darkened, a flash of something dangerous flickering in them. "You don't have a choice, Marcus. You've already made your decision the moment you started asking questions. This was always the plan. You were always meant to be part of it. Now, the only question left is whether you'll embrace your role, or fight it." Marcus could feel the weight of those words pressing down on him. His fists clenched at his sides, the anger rising like a fire within him. He couldn't let them control him. He couldn't be part of whatever this was. There had to be a way out, he just had to find it. The woman stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. Fighting it won't change anything. The harder you resist, the more you'll hurt yourself. You'll only make it worse. Maybe, Marcus snapped, his eyes flashing. But I'd rather die trying to escape than live as one of you. The tension in the room grew thicker, and for a moment, no one spoke. Marcus could feel the weight of their gazes, but it wasn't the cold, calculating gaze of the older man that disturbed him most. It was the pity in the woman's eyes. She didn't see him as a threat. She saw him as a lost cause. You think this is about escape, the older man finally said, his voice quiet but laced with venom. But you're wrong. This is about survival. The truth is, Marcus, there's nowhere to run. There's no escape. You've already played your part. Now it's time to finish what you started. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The finality in the older man's tone chilled him to the bone. It wasn't just a warning. It was a statement. The man knew what Marcus was going to do, before he even knew himself. Marcus stood there, trapped in the thick fog of confusion and fear, trying to summon the courage to make a choice. A way out. Anything. He wasn't sure if the options in front of him were real or just illusions created to keep him in line. Was there any hope for escape, or was he already too far gone to fight? The silence in the room deepened, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Marcus realized something even more terrifying: he might not be the one in control after all. Marcus felt the weight of those words sink into him like stones in his chest. His mind raced, his heart pounding with a mix of fear, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The older man's words seemed final, as though they had been written into the very fabric of his life. It was too much to bear, too much to process. But there was one thought that cut through the chaos in his mind. He wasn't done yet. You're wrong, Marcus spat, his voice filled with anger. I won't just play along. I'll fight this, whatever it takes. The older man's lips curled into a slight smile, as if he were humoring a child's tantrum. Fighting is what makes it worse, Marcus. You'll learn that soon enough. But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. He had to find a way out, any way to break free from this nightmare. His fists clenched, and he looked around the sterile room, the walls seeming to close in on him. Every part of him screamed to escape, to run, to defy what had been set before him. But then, something caught his eye. Something he hadn't noticed before, an unexpected detail in the corner of the room. A small panel, half hidden behind a stack of papers and equipment, was slightly ajar. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. His instincts kicked in, and without thinking, Marcus rushed toward it. He could feel the older man's gaze burning into his back, but at that moment, Marcus didn't care. The idea of escape was all-consuming, even if it was just a glimmer of hope. As he yanked the panel open, his eyes widened. Inside was a control console, blinking with a soft red light. Buttons, switches, and screens, all of them were staring back at him like an invitation. There was no time to hesitate. He didn't know what any of the controls meant, but his instincts told him he had to act. With shaking hands, he began pressing buttons, hoping for something, anything, that would give him a way out. The room seemed to hum with energy as the screens flickered, flashing images too quickly for him to make sense of. Then, the older man's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. You think you can just walk away from this? It's not that simple. You've already made your choice, Marcus. But Marcus wasn't listening. His heart was in his throat as he continued to press buttons, praying that the system could be hacked, that there was a way to undo whatever they had done to him. Then, without warning, a loud beep echoed in the room, and the screen before him blinked red. A warning. An error. The console seemed to glitch, flickering with static, before everything suddenly went dark. Panic surged through Marcus. No, 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 he muttered under his breath, slamming his hands against the panel in frustration. He had to fix it. He had to find a way to finish what he started. But before he could react, the silence in the room shattered. The woman's voice, cold and distant, broke the tension. "You should have listened, Marcus." And then, everything changed. The walls around him began to slide open, revealing an entirely new part of the facility, one he hadn't seen before. The scene before him was unlike anything he had imagined. It was a massive hall, filled with people who looked exactly like him. They all stood there, motionless, their faces blank and lifeless, like mannequins frozen in time. Rows upon rows of them, all in identical uniforms, their eyes fixed ahead as though they were waiting for something to happen. Marcus stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. The people around him, they weren't people. They were clones. Each one a replica of him, created for this dark, twisted purpose. This was the truth he hadn't been prepared for. "You're not the first, Marcus," the older man's voice echoed from behind him. As he stepped forward, a look of finality in his eyes. "You were never meant to be special. You're one of many. And now, it's your turn." Marcus felt his world crumble around him as he took in the horrifying sight. Everything he had known, the life he thought he had built, the identity he had believed was his, was nothing but a fabrication. He had been created for this purpose, to be one of them. Just another tool in the machine. The truth he had fought so hard to uncover had come at a cost, and it was more devastating than he could have imagined. But then, a sudden realization hit him. The system, the facility, it wasn't just about creating these clones. It was about control. They had been controlling him from the very beginning, shaping his life, his choices, his memories. The woman had been right. There had been no escape. No way to fight back. He had never truly been in control of his own destiny. Or had he? In that moment, something inside him clicked. Maybe they controlled his past, but they didn't control his future. With a sudden burst of strength, Marcus bolted toward the center of the room, where the console sat, flickering with its final warning. He had to act fast. He didn't know what the console could do, but it was his only chance. It was his last chance. The older man's voice echoed behind him, filled with frustration. "You can't change anything. It's already too late." Marcus's hands trembled as he slammed his fist down on the console, a final, desperate attempt to break free from the cycle they had trapped him in. The screen before him flashed, then went blank. A second later, the entire facility began to hum with power, the lights flickering on, the machines coming to life. And then, a final twist, the room went dark. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, the silence pressing in around him like a suffocating weight. He couldn't see anything. Couldn't hear anything. It felt as though he had been thrust into a void, suspended in time. But then, the lights flickered back on. The clones were gone. The facility was empty. And standing in the middle of the room, in the place where the console had once been, was Marcus, the real Marcus. The man who had been told he was just another cog in a machine. The man who had believed his life was preordained. But now, he was free. The twist he had never expected had unfolded before him, the real control had always been in his hands. And the truth was, Marcus had never been part of the system at all. Marcus stood there, frozen in the eerie silence, trying to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. The clone room, the dark facility, everything around him felt unreal. The flickering lights illuminated a cold, stark emptiness where rows of identical faces had once stood. His breath was shallow, his mind racing, still trying to process the sheer horror of what had unfolded. But now, everything had changed. The truth, truth, had shattered every belief he had about his life, about who he was. The confusion, the fear, the rage that had once consumed him were now replaced with a gnawing emptiness. The room was empty. The clones, those replicas of him, were gone. But how? What had he done? He felt a sudden presence behind him, the voice that had haunted him earlier now standing right there, as cold and calculating as ever. "You think you've won, Marcus?" The older man's voice was steady, but there was a trace of uncertainty now. "This isn't over. You can't undo what's been done." Marcus turned, his legs shaky but his resolve stronger than it had ever been. I didn't need to undo anything. I just needed to find the truth. The man stepped closer, but this time, there was a distance between them that hadn't existed before. He seemed hesitant now, not in control like he had been earlier. The truth doesn't matter now. You've already made your choice, and it's too late to turn back. Marcus shook his head, a slight smile creeping onto his face despite the chaos around him. I've made my choice. But I'm not going back to whatever twisted game you were playing. His mind was clear, his heart pounding with the adrenaline of his escape. This man, this entire system, had underestimated him. They had controlled his life, his choices, his every move, but they couldn't control his will. Not anymore. As Marcus stepped forward, he realized something more profound. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been caught in this system, people just like him, manipulated, controlled, made to believe they had no other choice. Maybe he wasn't the only one. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden hum of machines, filling the room with an ominous sound. The walls trembled, as if the entire facility was waking up after a long slumber. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He was in control now. You really think you can just walk away from this? The older man's voice was sharp, like the edge of a knife. There are consequences to your actions. Marcus didn't flinch. He had heard those words before, but now they had no power over him. Consequences are what you've been using to manipulate me, and they don't scare me anymore. For the first time, the older man hesitated. His cold demeanor cracked, revealing a flicker of doubt. But before Marcus could savor his victory, something in the shadows stirred. A figure emerged from the darkness, its presence chilling. Another person. Another layer to this intricate web of lies. It was the woman, the one who had first guided him through this maze, the one who had claimed she wanted him to uncover the truth. But now, standing before him, she seemed different. Her expression was no longer the cryptic mask of the mentor. There was something else in her eyes, something that sent a wave of unease through him. You think you're free, she said, her voice low but powerful. You're just a piece in a much larger game, Marcus. You were always meant to be part of this. Marcus took a step back, trying to read her face. You too? What is this all? What do you want from me? The woman shook her head, her gaze now filled with a mix of pity and resignation. What you've uncovered isn't the end, Marcus. It's only the beginning. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made his stomach drop. There's a bigger purpose behind all of this. A purpose you'll never understand. Marcus's mind raced. Was she telling the truth? Had he truly uncovered the core of the story, or was there more to the picture than he could see? The doubt crept back into his mind, threatening to undo everything he thought he knew. As if reading his thoughts, the woman took a step closer, her eyes locked onto his. There's a reason you were chosen, Marcus. A reason you were brought here. You weren't a mistake. You were always meant to play this part. Her words sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't let himself be swept into this web again. He wouldn't fall for it. Not now. You're lying, he said, his voice more forceful than he expected. You've been manipulating me this whole time. She didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at him with a mixture of sadness and understanding. I'm not lying. The truth is, Marcus, you were never meant to escape. This is your destiny. Your role in this world is already written, and no matter how much you try to fight it, you will return to this path. You always will. Marcus clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't ready to accept that. He had fought too hard, uncovered too much. He wasn't about to let them define his future. Not anymore. But before he could respond, the older man spoke again, his voice filled with something new, a mix of frustration and finality. You don't get it, do you? This facility, this entire operation, it was never about you in the way you think. It's about something much bigger. You've been part of something from the start, and now that you've opened the door, you can't close it. There's no turning back now, Marcus. And with that, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift. The room began to tremble, the lights flickering wildly as if the very building itself was coming alive. Marcus had no idea what was about to happen next, but one thing was clear: the world he had once known was gone. It was over. But what would come next? His mind raced with the possibilities. Could he really escape this endless cycle? Could he defy what seemed to be fate and take control of his destiny? The truth remained elusive, the consequences of his actions more unknown than ever. One thing was certain: this was only the beginning of a story that would change everything. The ground shook beneath Marcus's feet, and for a moment, it felt like the very walls of the dark facility were closing in on him. The trembling light flickered overhead, casting long, haunting shadows across the room, making everything feel distorted and surreal. His heart pounded in his chest, but despite the fear, a quiet determination settled inside him. He had come too far to turn back now. The woman stepped forward, her eyes never leaving him, and for a moment, Marcus almost thought she was going to say something else. But instead, her gaze softened as if she was seeing something in him that he couldn't understand. "You don't realize it yet, but you're part of something much bigger than you. You always were. But don't worry," she added, her voice now tinged with an almost affectionate tone. "You'll understand soon enough. The pieces are all falling into place." Marcus stood frozen, unwilling to let her words sink in. He wouldn't let himself be manipulated again. He had been lied to, tricked, and forced into a narrative that wasn't his own. He was done playing their game. He turned his attention back to the older man, who now seemed to be watching him with something that resembled regret. The tension between them was thick, as if they were both waiting for the other to make the next move. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment, the final decision that could either keep him trapped or set him free. The older man had been the architect of this nightmare, but Marcus wasn't going to let him control the end of the story. "I'm not a pawn in your game anymore," Marcus said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm choosing my own path." For the first time, the older man's mask slipped. He looked at Marcus with something akin to fear, though he quickly masked it again with his cold, calculating expression. "You think you have a choice? You think you can just walk away from this? You have no idea what's at stake." Marcus didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, but he knew what he had to do. He had to escape, had to find a way out of this labyrinth of lies and manipulation. But the more he thought about it, the more one question loomed larger than all the rest: why had this happened to him? That's when the woman spoke again, her voice softer, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "The truth is, Marcus, you were never meant to escape this place. Not because of any grand conspiracy, but because this was your destiny all along." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Destiny? Was it true? Was everything that had happened, every twist, every turn, part of some greater plan? No. He wouldn't believe it. He couldn't. He wasn't someone's puppet, and neither were the clones, the replicas of him, who had shared this same fate. "You think I'm just a piece in your twisted game," Marcus spat, his eyes narrowing. "But I'm not. I won't be. You've lost. I've already made my choice." The older man's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the room itself was holding its breath. But then, something unexpected happened. The machines that had been humming in the background suddenly powered down, and the lights flickered one last time before turning off completely. Silence enveloped the space. For the first time since Marcus had entered this nightmare, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The oppressive weight of the situation seemed to lift, as if a door had been opened, and for the first time, he saw a way out. Marcus didn't waste a moment. He turned toward the exit, determined to escape whatever this place was. He had learned enough. The truth, though elusive and painful, had freed him in a way he couldn't fully explain. The past was behind him. His future was his own to decide. The woman didn't move to stop him. She simply watched as he walked toward the exit, her expression unreadable. The older man, on the other hand, seemed to seethe with frustration but didn't make a move to chase him. He was too late. Marcus had already won. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him like a wave. The familiar world, with its noise, its chaos, and its bright lights, seemed like a distant memory. He had been trapped for so long in that dark world, surrounded by lies and secrets. But now, the truth was his to own. He paused for a moment, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. The facility was behind him. The people who had tried to control him, who had tried to control his very life, were nothing but shadows now. He was free. But that didn't mean the story was over. There was still so much to learn. So much left to uncover. What happened to the clones? Were they truly gone, or was there more to this story than he realized? And the people behind the facility, what were their true motives? It didn't matter right now. Marcus had his life back. But the questions lingered. As he walked down the empty street, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of something far greater. But one thing was certain, whatever came next, it was up to him. He had taken control of his own destiny, and that was all that mattered. In the distance, the city lights twinkled, a beacon of freedom. And though Marcus didn't have all the answers yet, he knew he would keep searching. He would uncover the rest of the truth, no matter where it led him. Because this story wasn't over. It was just the beginning. As Marcus continued down the quiet street, the hum of the city around him felt distant, almost unreal. The weight of the night's events lingered in his mind, and the adrenaline from his escape slowly ebbed away, leaving a quiet exhaustion in its wake. He had no clear plan for what came next, only the raw, undeniable sense that he had reclaimed a piece of his life that had been stolen from him. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the streets as the night stretched on. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that he had to keep moving forward, away from the dark facility, away from the lies. His thoughts drifted back to the woman, the mysterious figure who had told him things he wasn't ready to hear. What did she mean by destiny? Was his entire life really part of some greater plan? He didn't know, but he wasn't going to let it dictate his future anymore. The questions, however, didn't stop there. What had he truly learned about himself in that place? What was the truth about the clones and their connection to him? He had always felt different, always known that there was more to his story than the world had ever told him. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt as though he could choose who he wanted to be, free from the shadows of the past. Suddenly, a voice interrupted his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. Marcus. He turned, startled by the sound. It was a voice he hadn't expected to hear again, the voice of someone he thought was long gone. Standing in front of him was the woman from the facility. Her face was unreadable, her expression calm, yet there was a certain intensity to her presence. The same intensity that had drawn him in earlier. "You're not alone," she said simply, her voice quiet but strong. Marcus stared at her, confused and a little wary. "What do you mean by that? You've been a part of all this. I don't know if I can trust you." "I understand why you'd feel that way," she replied. "But the truth is, the people you thought were controlling you, those who made you feel trapped, they aren't the only ones with power. You have power too, Marcus. Power to change things." The words settled over him like a heavy weight, but they also sparked something deep inside. Could it be true? Had he really been given the chance to rewrite his future? "I've spent so much of my life running," Marcus confessed, his voice quieter now. "Running from the truth, from the fear of what might happen if I finally faced it. But now I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do with all the knowledge I have, with everything I've learned. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something I can't fully understand." The woman nodded, as if she had heard this story many times before. "The world you knew is over, Marcus. But it doesn't have to be the end of your story. You can use the knowledge, the power, that you now hold. You can change the system. You can make it right." Her words stirred something in Marcus, a spark of determination he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he saw the potential for something greater. No longer just a victim, no longer just a piece in someone else's game, he could now be the one who shaped his own destiny. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, his mind racing. "What happens now?" he asked. "Where do I go from here?" The woman's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Marcus could see the complexity of her emotions, fear, hope, and something deeper, something familiar. "Now you go wherever you want, Marcus. You've earned the right to choose. You have a chance to expose the truth, to show the world what really happened, and to make sure no one ever has to suffer like you did. It won't be easy. There will be others who try to stop you, but I believe in you. I always have." The world seemed to hold its breath as Marcus processed her words. He felt a mixture of fear and excitement, fear of the unknown, excitement about the possibility of change. He could feel the weight of everything he had been through, and yet, in that moment, it wasn't overwhelming. It felt freeing. "I'm ready," he said quietly, the words firm and resolute. "I'm ready to make a difference. Ready to find my place in all of this." The woman gave a small smile, almost approving. "Good. You have everything you need within you. The next step is yours." And with that, she turned and disappeared into the night, as quietly as she had arrived. Marcus stood there for a moment, taking in the vastness of the world around him. The city stretched out before him, endless and full of possibilities. He wasn't sure where the road would lead, but he knew it would be his path to walk. The journey wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The answers would come in time. The truth would unfold. And though the road ahead would be challenging, Marcus now understood that he had the power to face it. He wasn't the same person who had walked into that dark facility. He had changed. He had evolved. He took one last look at the dark shadows of the city, the place that had held him captive for so long. Then, with newfound determination, he stepped forward, embracing whatever lay ahead. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a sense of peace. Because no matter what happened, he knew one thing for certain: his story was his own to write. The rest would come in time. The end, or maybe, just the beginning.